The rain was coming down in sheets that night, the kind of torrential downpour that makes you grateful to be indoors. I remember sitting on my couch wrapped in my favorite oversized blanket, the one with the subtle blue pattern that my grandmother had given me years ago. The apartment was eerily quiet except for the persistent drumming of raindrops against the windows and the occasional rumble of thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of our building. I had just settled in for a quiet evening alone, my roommate Jake having mentioned earlier that he was heading out to meet some friends at a bar downtown. Jake and I had been roommates for almost 2 years now. We met during our junior year of college through mutual friends and decided to get an apartment together after graduation when we both landed jobs in the city. He was the stereotypical straight guy roommate, athletic, perpetually dating different women, and maintaining that particular brand of masculine neatness that meant everything was technically clean but never quite organized. I, on the other hand, preferred things in their proper place and valued my quiet evenings at home rather than the bar-hopping lifestyle Jake embraced. Our friendship had always existed in that comfortable space where we could enjoy each other's company without feeling the need to fill every silence with conversation. We respected each other's boundaries and had fallen into an easy rhythm of coexistence. I knew his schedule, he knew mine, and we navigated around each other's lives with the practiced ease of two people who genuinely liked each other but also valued their independence. The storm had been forecasted for days, but nobody expected it to hit with such ferocity. The weather alerts on my phone had been going off all evening, warnings about flash floods and high winds. I had texted Jake earlier to make sure he was safe, and he'd responded with his typical nonchalance, assuring me he was fine and would be home later. That was 3 hours ago, and as the storm intensified, I found myself glancing at my phone more frequently, a small knot of worry forming in my stomach. The lights flickered once, twice, and then steadied again. I pulled my blanket tighter around my shoulders, grateful for its warmth as the temperature in the apartment seemed to drop with each passing hour. The heating system in our building was old and temperamental at the best of times. During storms like this, it was anyone's guess whether it would continue functioning properly. Just as I was about to text Jake again, I heard the familiar sound of keys jingling at the door. There was some fumbling, a muffled curse, and then the door swung open to reveal my roommate, completely drenched from head to toe. His usually perfectly styled dark hair was plastered to his forehead, and his light blue button-down shirt had turned nearly transparent, clinging to his chest and shoulders in a way that made me quickly avert my eyes. "Holy hell!" Jake exclaimed, closing the door behind him with more force than necessary as another gust of wind threatened to tear it from his grip. "It's absolutely insane out there. The streets are flooding, and I had to abandon my Uber 3 blocks away because the roads are becoming impassable." I couldn't help but smile at his dramatic entrance. I was starting to worry. "You should get out of those wet clothes before you catch pneumonia or something." Jake nodded, already kicking off his soaked shoes and peeling his socks off with a grimace. The bar was packed with people waiting out the storm. I figured I'd rather make a run for it than be stuck there all night. He shivered visibly. Might not have been my best decision. "Go change," I urged, gesturing toward his bedroom. "I'll make some tea or something." He disappeared down the hallway, leaving a trail of water droplets in his wake. I sighed, knowing I'd end up mopping that up later, but decided it could wait until morning. In the kitchen, I filled the electric kettle and pulled out 2 mugs, dropping tea bags into each. The familiar routine was comforting against the backdrop of the storm's chaos outside. When Jake returned, he had changed into dry sweatpants and a worn college t-shirt. His hair was still damp but no longer dripping, and he had a towel draped around his shoulders. He looked younger somehow, more vulnerable without his usual confident demeanor. "The power's out in at least 3 neighborhoods around us," he said, accepting the mug of tea I offered with a grateful nod. "Sarah texted me that her whole block is dark. We're lucky we still have electricity." As if on cue, the lights flickered again, more insistently this time, and we both froze, staring at each other in the sudden dimness. After a tense moment, the lights stabilized, and we exhaled in unison. "Don't jinx it," I warned, only half joking. "If the power goes out, we're going to freeze in this apartment." Jake took a sip of his tea and grimaced slightly. He'd never been much of a tea drinker, preferring coffee or energy drinks, but seemed to appreciate the warmth. "Mind if I crash out here tonight?" he asked, nodding toward the couch. "My room's freezing for some reason." I think there might be a draft coming from the window, even though it's closed. The request caught me off guard. In our 2 years of living together, we'd maintained a polite separation of personal spaces. We shared meals occasionally and sometimes watched movies together, but we'd never encroached on each other's private domains. The couch in the living room had always been neutral territory. Yeah, of course, I found myself saying. No problem at all. Jake smiled, that easy, genuine smile that had probably charmed countless women over the years. Thanks, man. I appreciate it. The storm continued to rage outside as we settled into an unexpectedly comfortable evening. I had been watching a documentary series about ocean exploration before Jake arrived, and he seemed content to join me, occasionally commenting on the bizarre deep-sea creatures that appeared on screen. The normalcy of the situation, just two friends watching TV together, helped ease the strange tension that had momentarily surfaced when he asked to stay in the living room. As the night progressed, the temperature in the apartment continued to drop. I remained cozy under my grandmother's blanket, but I noticed Jake shifting uncomfortably on the other end of the couch, occasionally rubbing his arms or tucking his hands under his thighs for warmth. "You cold?" I asked during a lull in the documentary. He shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant. "A bit. The heating's definitely not keeping up with the storm." I hesitated for just a moment before offering. "I could grab another blanket from my room if you want." "That would be great. Thanks," Jake said, and I couldn't help but notice the relief in his voice. I reluctantly unwrapped myself from my cocoon of warmth and hurried to my bedroom. The problem was, I didn't actually have another decent blanket. I had sheets, yes, and a thin throw that was more decorative than functional, but my grandmother's blanket was the only substantial one I owned. I stood in my bedroom doorway, contemplating my options, before grabbing the throw and heading back to the living room. When I handed Jake the thin blanket, he looked at it dubiously. "Thanks," he said, but his expression made it clear that the flimsy throw wasn't going to do much against the increasing chill. We returned our attention to the documentary, but I found myself increasingly distracted by Jake's discomfort. He was trying not to show it, but I could see the goosebumps on his arms and the way he kept shifting positions, trying to generate warmth. The wind howled outside, a particularly violent gust rattling the windows. The lights flickered again, longer this time, and when they came back on, they seemed dimmer than before. The heating system made a concerning clunking sound and then fell silent. "That can't be good," Jake muttered, voicing what we were both thinking. I pulled my blanket tighter around myself, suddenly aware of how fortunate I was to have it. The apartment was now genuinely cold, our breath becoming visible in the air before us. The thin walls of our building offered little protection against the elements, and without the heating system, the temperature was dropping rapidly. We sat in silence for a few minutes, the documentary continuing on screen, though neither of us was really watching anymore. Jake was now visibly shivering despite his attempts to hide it, the decorative throw clutched tightly around his shoulders, but providing little actual warmth. I was debating what to do when Jake suddenly spoke, his voice hesitant in a way I'd rarely heard before. "Hey, this is going to sound weird, but would you mind if we shared that blanket? This throw is useless, and I'm freezing my ass off here." The request hung in the air between us. In our 2 years of friendship, we'd maintained certain unspoken physical boundaries. We might occasionally bump shoulders or give brief hugs when the situation warranted, but we'd never been the type of friends who were physically affectionate or comfortable with prolonged contact. "Yeah, sure," I heard myself say before I'd fully processed the implications. "It's big enough for both of us." Jake looked relieved and slightly embarrassed. "Thanks, man. I swear I'm not trying to be weird. It's just really cold." "It's fine," I assured him, trying to sound more casual than I felt as I lifted one side of the blanket. "Come on over before all the warm air escapes." There was a moment of awkward maneuvering as Jake slid closer on the couch. He was careful to maintain a few inches of space between us, but even so, I was acutely aware of his presence, the subtle scent of his shampoo, the slight dampness still clinging to his hair, the warmth radiating from his body despite his complaints of being cold. We rearranged the blanket so it covered both of us, creating a shared pocket of warmth that was undeniably more comfortable than our previous separate states. On screen, the documentary continued, now showing the bioluminescent creatures that inhabited the ocean's darkest depths. "This is better," Jake said after a moment, his voice low. Thanks. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. There was something strangely intimate about sharing a blanket, something that transcended our usual roommate dynamic. The storm continued to rage outside, rain lashing against the windows, but inside our little cocoon of warmth, there was a different kind of tension brewing. We sat like that for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes or so, both of us pretending to be absorbed in the documentary while hyper-aware of each other's presence. The initial awkwardness gradually began to dissipate, replaced by a comfortable warmth that made my eyelids grow heavy. I must have dozed off at some point because I woke with a start to find that the documentary had ended and the Netflix "Are You Still Watching?" screen was displayed. The apartment was now completely dark except for the glow of the television, and the storm outside seemed to have intensified, if that was even possible. It took me a moment to register that during my impromptu nap, the distance between Jake and me had disappeared entirely. He was fast asleep, his head resting against my shoulder, his body pressed along the length of mine. His breathing was deep and even, his face relaxed in sleep in a way it never was when he was awake. I should have felt uncomfortable. I should have gently extricated myself from the situation or woken him up. Instead, I found myself studying his face in the dim light of the TV screen, the dark sweep of his eyelashes against his cheeks, the slight stubble along his jaw, the way his lips were parted slightly as he breathed. There had always been an unacknowledged undercurrent to our friendship, at least on my part. I'd never allowed myself to examine it too closely, knowing that Jake was straight and that any feelings beyond friendship would only complicate our living situation. But in that moment, with the storm raging outside and the world reduced to just the two of us under my grandmother's blanket, I couldn't deny the warmth spreading through my chest that had nothing to do with the shared body heat. As if sensing my gaze, Jake stirred slightly, murmuring something incomprehensible before settling again, his hand coming to rest against my knee under the blanket. The casual touch sent an unexpected jolt through me, and I held my breath, afraid that any movement might wake him and end this strange, suspended moment. The rational part of my brain knew that this meant nothing. Jake was cold, we were friends, and he had fallen asleep in an awkward position. It happened. But another part of me, a part one usually kept carefully contained, wondered what it would be like if this meant something more. I must have shifted slightly because Jake's eyes suddenly fluttered open. There was a moment of confusion as he oriented himself, realizing his position against my shoulder. I expected him to pull away immediately, to make a joke to diffuse the awkwardness, but instead, he remained where he was, his eyes meeting mine in the dim light. "Sorry," he said softly, his voice rough with sleep. "Didn't mean to use you as a pillow." "It's fine," I replied, my own voice sounding strange to my ears. "You were tired." Neither of us moved. The moment stretched between us, filled with unspoken questions and possibilities. The storm provided a backdrop of white noise, rain, wind, distant thunder, that seemed to isolate us from the rest of the world. "What time is it?" Jake finally asked, still making no effort to move away. I glanced at the clock on the cable box. "Just after 2. He nodded, as if this information was somehow significant. "The storm's still bad." "Yeah." Another silence fell, neither comfortable nor uncomfortable, but charged with something I couldn't quite name. Jake's hand was still resting on my knee, a point of warmth that I was hyper-aware of. "This is nice," he said suddenly, his voice so quiet I almost didn't hear him over the rain. "Being warm, I mean." "Yeah," I agreed, not sure what else to say. "Better than freezing separately." Jake laughed softly, the sound vibrating through his body and into mine where we were pressed together. "Definitely. I don't know who moved first, maybe we both did, but somehow the few remaining inches of space between us disappeared." Jake's head returned to my shoulder, but this time it was a conscious choice rather than the accident of sleep. My arm found its way around his back, and his hand remained on my knee, a point of connection that felt both innocent and charged with meaning. We stayed like that, neither of us speaking, as the documentary's autoplay function kicked in and started another episode. The narrator's soothing voice described the mating habits of octopuses, but I couldn't focus on the words. All I could think about was the weight of Jake against me, the rhythm of his breathing, the way our bodies seemed to fit together in a way I'd never anticipated. "We should probably try to get some sleep," I said eventually. when the silence had stretched too long and I felt the need to say something, anything, to break the tension. Jake nodded against my shoulder. Probably. Neither of us moved. We could. I started, then hesitated, not sure what I was about to suggest. Jake lifted his head to look at me, his expression unreadable in the dim light. We could what? I swallowed hard. We could make the couch into a bed. It pulls out. Might be more comfortable than sitting up all night. Something flickered across his face. Relief? Disappointment? Before he nodded. Yeah, that makes sense. The process of converting the couch into a pull-out bed required us to separate, to leave the warmth of the blanket and face the cold air of the apartment. We worked together efficiently, removing the cushions and pulling out the hidden mattress. It was an old mechanism, slightly rusty, and it took both of us pulling to get it fully extended. The mattress was thin and not particularly comfortable, but it was better than sleeping upright. I retrieved my pillow from my bedroom and offered Jake the decorative ones from the couch. We arranged ourselves on opposite sides of the pull-out bed, the blanket spread between us, a careful distance maintained. Good night, Jake said, his voice oddly formal as he settled onto his side, facing away from me. Good night, I echoed, turning to face the opposite direction. The storm continued outside, a constant reminder of why we were in this situation to begin with. I lay awake, listening to Jake's breathing, wondering if he was already asleep or if he too was lying there, thinking about the strange intimacy of the evening. I must have eventually drifted off because the next thing I knew, early morning light was filtering through the windows. The storm had passed, leaving behind an eerie quiet broken only by the occasional drip of water from the gutters outside. And Jake was pressed against my back, his arm draped over my waist, his face buried in the space between my shoulder blades. At some point during the night, the careful distance we'd established had disappeared entirely, and we'd gravitated toward each other, seeking warmth or comfort or something else entirely. I lay perfectly still, afraid to move, afraid to break whatever spell had allowed this to happen. Jake's breathing was deep and even, suggesting he was still asleep, unaware of our position or the conflict raging inside me. Part of me wanted to carefully extract myself before he woke up, to spare us both the awkwardness of acknowledging what had happened. But another part, a stronger part, wanted to stay exactly where I was, to see what would happen when he woke up, to face whatever this was head-on rather than pretending it hadn't happened. In the end, the decision was made for me. Jake stirred, his arm tightening briefly around my waist before he seemed to realize where he was and who he was holding. I felt the exact moment awareness hit him. His body tensed, his breathing changed, and the arm around my waist slowly, carefully withdrew. I counted to 10 in my head, giving him time to move away before I turned over to face him. He was lying on his back now, staring at the ceiling, his expression unreadable. "Morning," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. He glanced at me, then back at the ceiling. "Morning." The awkwardness I had feared descended upon us, thick and suffocating. I searched for something to say, some way to acknowledge what had happened without making it a bigger deal than it was. "Some storm, huh?" I finally managed, immediately regretting the banality of the comment. Jake nodded, still not looking at me. "Yeah, thanks for, sharing your blanket. And the couch." "No problem." We fell silent again. Outside, a car honked, a reminder that the world continued to exist beyond the walls of our apartment, beyond the strange bubble of intimacy we'd found ourselves in during the storm. Jake sat up suddenly, running a hand through his hair, which was sticking up in all directions. "I should probably shower. Get ready for the day." I nodded, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in my stomach. "Yeah, me too." He stood, hesitated for a moment as if he wanted to say something more, then turned and headed toward the bathroom without another word. I remained on the pull-out bed, listening to the sound of the bathroom door closing, then the shower turning on. The blanket still held Jake's warmth, and I pulled it around myself, trying to sort through the tangle of emotions the night had left me with. Nothing had happened, not really. We'd shared a blanket during a storm. We'd fallen asleep, and, in the unconsciousness of sleep, had sought each other's warmth. It was a basic human instinct, nothing more. To read anything else into it would be foolish, would risk the comfortable friendship and living arrangement we'd built over the past 2 years. And yet there had been that moment when Jake had woken up in the middle of the night, when he'd realized he was leaning against me. And instead of pulling away, he had stayed. There had been something in his eyes then, something I couldn't quite decipher, but that had made my heart race in a way that had nothing to do with fear or discomfort. The shower turned off, and I quickly got up, folding the blanket and beginning the process of converting the bed back into a couch. By the time Jake emerged from the bathroom, a towel wrapped around his waist and droplets of water still clinging to his chest, I had the living room back in order and was in the kitchen, making coffee as if it were any other morning. "Shower's free," he said, pausing in the doorway of the kitchen. I nodded, keeping my eyes on the coffee maker. "Thanks. I'll just finish making this first." Jake lingered for a moment longer than necessary, and I could feel his gaze on me. "Listen, about last night." "It's fine," I interrupted, not ready to hear whatever explanation or apology he was about to offer. "It was cold. We shared a blanket. No big deal." He was quiet for a moment, and when I finally looked up at him, his expression was unreadable. "Right," he said finally. "No big deal." He turned and headed to his bedroom, closing the door behind him with a soft click that somehow felt more final than a slam would have. I stood in the kitchen, listening to the coffee maker gurgle, wondering if I had just made a terrible mistake. The storm had created a moment of vulnerability, of honesty, and I had just shut it down out of fear. Fear of rejection, fear of ruining our friendship, fear of acknowledging the feelings I'd been suppressing for longer than I cared to admit. The coffee finished brewing, and I poured 2 cups, adding the precise amount of sugar and cream that Jake preferred to his. A peace offering, perhaps, or just a continuation of our normal routine, a signal that nothing had changed despite the night we'd just shared. I carried the mugs to the hallway and paused outside Jake's door, suddenly unsure. Before I could decide whether to knock or retreat, the door opened, and Jake stood there, now dressed in jeans and a t-shirt, his hair still damp from the shower. "I made coffee," I said unnecessarily, holding out his mug. He took it, his fingers brushing against mine in the process. "Thanks." We stood there for a moment, the hallway suddenly feeling too narrow, too intimate. Jake took a sip of his coffee, then looked at me over the rim of his mug. "Perfect," he said softly. "You always get it right." Something in his tone made me look up, and the expression in his eyes caught me off guard, a mixture of warmth, uncertainty, and something else I couldn't quite identify. "Jake, about last night." I started, then stopped, not sure what I wanted to say. He waited, patient, his eyes never leaving mine. "It wasn't nothing," I finally said, the words coming out in a rush. "At least, not to me." Jake's expression softened, and a small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Not to me either." The admission hung between us, neither of us quite sure where to go from there. The storm had passed, but it had left something in its wake. A shift in our relationship, a door opened that couldn't easily be closed again. "So what now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Jake shrugged, but the gesture wasn't dismissive. It was thoughtful, considering. "I don't know exactly. But maybe the next time there's a storm, we don't wait for the power to go out before we share that blanket." The suggestion was tentative, leaving room for interpretation, for retreat, if necessary. But his eyes held mine steadily, and I saw in them a reflection of my own uncertainty, my own hope. "I'd like that," I said simply. Jake smiled then, a real smile that reached his eyes and made something warm unfurl in my chest. "Me too." We stood there in the hallway, coffee mugs in hand, the morning light streaming through the windows, illuminating the dust motes in the air between us. Nothing had been definitively resolved, no declarations made, no boundaries explicitly redrawn. But something had shifted, something important. The storm had passed, but perhaps it had left behind something more valuable than destruction, a new beginning, a chance to explore the uncharted territory that lay between friendship and something more. And as Jake reached out to squeeze my shoulder briefly before heading toward the kitchen, I felt a sense of possibility unfurling within me, as vast and unpredictable as the storm that had brought us to this moment. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, casting a golden glow across our apartment. The world was washed clean by the rain, renewed and full of potential. And inside, in the quiet space between us, something new was beginning to grow, something that, like the storm, had perhaps been brewing for longer than either of us had realized. Total_char_count, 14,015.